Welcome. We're so happy to be here to hear from Dr. Vered Weiss about her exciting, interesting research on Israeli fantasy and science fiction, fantastical time, space, and the modern promised land. Before I introduce Dr. Weiss, who we've been thrilled to have with us at MSU this year, I just want to remind you of our next two upcoming events. So we have an event this Friday from 12:30 to 5 in the James Madison College library, which is the third floor of CASE. All of you who'd like to come are invited, or those of you who aren't in Michigan and are live streaming, you're invited to live stream with us. But we have our annual undergraduate research conference where students present their research, and every year we invite an alumni to give a keynote. And this year it's Josh Cantor giving a short talk on inspiring the Jewish future by looking to the past. We'll have complimentary pizza there for those of you who'd like to join. And then on Tuesday, the 18th, we're having our annual Rabin Brill lecture, Holocaust lecture on paper love and exploration into family identity, myth, and memory, by Sarah Wildman. It's a really, really interesting book about a granddaughter who finds her grandfather's love letters of someone who he had to leave behind in Vienna during the Holocaust. So I think it'll really speak to your generation and multiple generations as well. And she's a beautiful writer. Unlike me and many other academics that do more dry writing, she really is a beautiful writer. So with that, I want to introduce Vered Weiss, who's the Serling Israeli Visiting Scholar, and we have Michael Serling with us, who created that endowment, and she's also supported by the Israeli Institute, teaching fellow here at Michigan State, and she's of course teaching 4 courses in integrated arts and humanities on Jerusalem, on Israeli cinema, on monsters and literature, doing an amazing job, and she's been an amazing colleague and helping us with a lot of our programming. So she is co-editor of Tracing Topographies, Revisiting the Concentration Camp 70 Years After the Liberation of Auschwitz. That was published from Routledge in 2017. And she is co-editing a volume about Israeli culture and post-traumatic stress disorder from Lexington Books. Her current research project explores the interplay between the location of marginalized characters and the ways in which narrative empathy is formulated in literature. And she's also collaborating on a co-edited volume about Israeli speculative fiction. So she's super productive. She's always, whenever you talk to her, has lots of exciting ideas. And she's making huge contributions to MSU. So thanks so much we look forward to your talk and learning from it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Thanks everyone for coming. I'd like to thank the Michael and Elaine Serling Institute for Jewish Studies and Modern Israel for hosting me as the Serling Visiting Israeli Scholar. And I am thrilled. I was excited before, but I'm absolutely thrilled to have Michael Serling here with us today. I would also like to thank the Center for Integrative Arts and for Integrative Studies in the Arts and the Humanities, and of course the Israeli Institute for making it possible for me to be here. So I am absolutely delighted to share some of my recent research, and today's talk is based on a chapter in the forthcoming Palgrave Handbook of Global Fantasy, which will come out next month, May 28th. And as the editors Ilana Gomel and Daniel Gurevich note, this handbook is an overview of fantasy outside the Anglo-American hegemony. So the collection spotlights fantasy literatures in India, in Australia, in Italy, Greece, Poland, Russia, China, and many other areas of Europe, Asia, and the global south. And my chapter explores Israeli fantasy and science fiction. So fantasy and science fiction as literary genres invite readers to enter an alternative or strange world. In his famous essay, Art as Technique, Viktor Shklovsky of the Russian Formalism Theoretical School outlines the concept of defamiliarization, also translated as estrangement in literature, arguing that, quote, the purpose of art is to impart the sensation of things as they are perceived and not as they are known. And his famous phrase suggests that art exists that one may recover the sensation of life. It exists to make one feel things, to make the stone stony. Now, for fantasy and science fiction to work as literary genres, the implied reader and author have to first agree that what is real and what is fantasy. So to borrow Shklovsky's example, for fantasy and science fiction to agree, the implied author and the implied reader need to first agree there is a stone and that the stone was initially stony. Now, the complications of this seemingly simple requirement within the Israeli context are twofold. First, like for all readers, 20th and 21st century quantum physics theory's confirmation render perception and representation of reality complicated. And second, the notion of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people entails ideas about the promised land, which is a concept that seems to be taken straight out of the realms of fantasy. So concepts of time and space in Israeli science fiction and fantasy are thus inherently unstable, constantly reconfigured, negotiated, and contested. The literary time space, or chronotope, is the focal point of the narrative. It unites the narrative inscriptions of time, space, and character or agent. So the chronotope is not only the when and where of the narrative, but the connection between time, space, and character that participates in character and plot development. In his initial formulation of the chronotope as intrinsic connectedness of temporal and spatial relationships that are artistically expressed in literature, Michael Bakhtin notes that chronotopes are significant for plot development and generic distinctions. Now, the most central and ubiquitous aspect of science fiction and fantasy chronotopes is the unique concepts of time and space. So science fiction and fantasy alternative worlds either tamper with or undermine contemporary perceptions of realistic time and space. As Ilana Gomel suggests, quote, science fiction is concerned with the projection and elaboration of alternative fictional worlds whose ontological features are radically different from the world of conscious reality, end quote. And like science fiction, fantasy tampers with realistic laws of nature, with realistic time and space, and is articulated as, quote, that hesitation experienced by a person who knows only the laws of nature, confronting an apparently supernatural event, end quote. So both genres, both science fiction and fantasy, invite readers to explore and experience alternative time space, and unlocking the text's chronotopes is key to readers' enjoyment. So if you try to read a fantasy or science fiction book as if it's a realistic book, you will not enjoy your reading. Yet Israeli time-space is already ambiguous, as the nation-state's establishment is based upon a conflation of primordial Judaic myths and modern Zionist narratives, and its current borders are constantly contended and reconfigured. In correlation, Israeli science fiction and fantasy chronotopes are nuanced. So certain productive classifications of Israeli science fiction and fantasy allow a more refined consideration of regional literature. So the following analysis outlines two main subgenres in 21st century Israeli science fiction and fantasy. The first is Judaic Israeli science fiction and fantasy, and the second is Universalist Israeli science fiction and fantasy. So Judaic Israeli science fiction and fantasy engages with Judaic traditions and formative Jewish and Israeli locations and historical events. And Universalist Israeli science fiction and fantasy refrains from engaging with any Judaic tradition or formative Israeli and Jewish Israeli locations and historical events. Now, texts that merge Judaic Israeli science fiction and fantasy and Universalist Israeli science fiction and fantasy I term them hybrid Israeli science fiction and fantasy. And these texts engage with Judaic Israeli concepts, tropes, and events in a sporadic or non-committal manner. Now, these three generic subdivisions or subgenres reflect 21st century Israeli identity's tensions between local particular concerns and transnational or transcultural issues shared by Israelis and readers worldwide. Now, the Israeli science fiction and fantasy scene is teeming. And already a decade ago, the list of science fiction and fantasy books provided in With Both Feet on the Clouds, Fantasy in Israeli Culture, which is the seminal book about Israeli science fiction and fantasy, was long and varied. And it included formative authors such as Amos Keinan, Orly Kastelblum, Etgar Keret, as well as emerging voices such as Shimon Adaf and Nir Bar'am. And the 21st century has seen an expansion of Israeli science fiction and fantasy on platforms such as Hayoyihiyeh magazine. So Hayoyihiyeh is usually translated as Once Upon a Future, and it's a speculative fiction anthology. And the online journal Bli Panika, No Panic, which is, of course, an allusion to the wonderful Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, as well as the Icon and Utopia festivals, many of which are supported by the Israeli Society for Science Fiction and Fantasy. Now, focusing on 21st century Israeli science fiction and fantasy that was written in Hebrew and published in Israel, so not Jewish speculative fiction, not Jewish science fiction and fantasy more broadly, nor Israeli science fiction and fantasy that is written in other languages in Israel, focusing on science fiction and fantasy that was written in Hebrew and published in Israel. This talk undermines certain generic rubrics, and I will explore children's literature alongside young adult literature and adult literature. However, this talk does not attempt to be comprehensive. There are scores of excellent Israeli science fiction and fantasy texts. Rather, this talk highlights central trends in Israeli science fiction and fantasy. So, one of the most notable aspects in Judaic Israeli science fiction and fantasy is the text's engagement with the notion of the promised land. Now, the notion of the promised land is simultaneously known and familiar and inherently incomprehensible. It is conceptually both a place, a real place that one has to reach and attain in order to achieve prosperity, and it is also a nebulous idea about the promise of prosperity. So the promised land can be understood as the area that God had promised Abraham in the biblical narrative in Genesis, which entails two complications. neither the spatial nor the conceptual notions are clear. The initial outline provides a problematic spatial reference to the location of the Promised Land, establishing eastern and western borders along the Egyptian river, presumably the Nile, and the Euphrates, but no northern or southern borders. And then, so this is in Genesis. This is in Genesis, and then the biblical text then offers a revised outline of the borders in the book of Numbers. Yet, the initial spatial problems highlight the conceptual ambiguity as well as the ethical and moral dilemmas, because the land is promised even though there are people living there, and the promise thus requires a violent expulsion or genocide of the local inhabitants. Now, the majority of the biblical narrative is anchored in the Promised Land chronotope, as every plotline and every character are propelled by the need and requirement to reach the Promised Land. Yet, even when the Israelites reach the Promised Land, and even after they conquer the land, the narrative outlines a continual strive towards another realm of promise, another level of piety that might bring them closer to divinity. Now, drawing upon a distinction between small p place and capital P place, the former, so small p place being the physical home and childhood landscape, and capital P place being the idea of the land, with its symbolic meaning and represented in cultural artifacts. Zaligurevich notes that the divine voice in the biblical narrative, quote, intervenes in the natural course of earthly wanderings from place to place and plucks it out of its ordinary meaning. To reach and attain his capital P place, Abraham must leave his lower case P place, and the notion of place is thereby radically altered, end quote. The problematic aspects of the Promised Land haunt modern Israel and Israeli identities, as modern socio-political realities seem to replicate mythical ethical dilemmas of the biblical narrative's Promised Land chronotope in Israeli realities. Now, before we continue, there are a couple of aspects of modern Jewish Israeli culture that are significant to the discussion of Israeli science fiction and fantasy. Initially, one has to be aware of the role of Zionism in Israeli culture on the one hand, and the paramount role of literature in the articulation of Zionism on the other hand. So Zionism is not only a political movement, but it is also a cultural movement, that is intricately intertwined with the Hebrew revival. The poetry and prose produced by cultural Zionists envisioned the land and language as part of a continual Judaic tradition that was reimagined into modernity. The literary and cultural aspects of the movement cannot be understated, and as Gil Hochberg notes, the inception of Zionism is based upon a fantasy, specifically Zionist utopianism. So Zionist utopias seek to, quote, leap boldly into the future, even as they outline a return of the Jewish nation to its ancestral land. And indeed, as Keren Omri notes, quote, the very founding of the nation can be attributed to utopian visions set out by at least two key literary texts, Alt-Neuland by Theodor Herzl, published in 1902, and before this, the lesser known Journey to the Land of Israel in the year 800 to the 6000 by Elchanan Leib Levinsky, published in 1892, said by some to be the first fictional novel written in modern Hebrew, end quote. Both texts, Herzl's and Levinsky's, outline a return to the Promised Land. So one of the most fascinating aspects of 21st century Israeli science fiction and fantasy is the conflation of modern Zionist ethos and the biblical myth of the Promised Land. And then, whether implicitly or explicitly, and even when it's a gaping lack, the constant call beckoning to return to the Promised Land echoes in Israeli science fiction and fantasy. So Israeli science fiction and fantasy operates in a continual conversation with what Ilana Gomel and Vered Karti Shem Tov termed a limbotopian genre, which, quote, accesses and critiques collective narratives of history and, in doing so, attempts to go beyond outworn ideological forms and conventions. As Gomel notes, the chronotope of Israeli science fiction and fantasy is located in the space of history, specifically in the Promised Land chronotope. So, in Judaic Israeli science fiction and fantasy, the Promised Land chronotope dictates that both the plot and character development are anchored in Jewish and Israeli culture and are driven by either a need to return to the Promised Land or an attempt to escape the need to return. And there are many texts that fit into this definition of Judaic Israeli science fiction and fantasy to illustrate the main attributes of the Promised Land chronotope, as well as to show some of the diversity within this category. This section explores writers whose work is productively tethered to the Promised Land chronotope. An absolute trailblazer in Israeli fantasy, Hagar Yanai, has written several books, including collaborating with Ilana Gomel and Daniel Goevich on With Both Feet on the Clouds. And one of Yanai's important contributions to Israeli fantasy is the Leviathan trilogy, which is comprised of the Leviathan of Babylon, The Water Between the Worlds, and The Journey to the Heart of the Abyss. The left image is the Leviathan of Babylon. The one in the middle is The Water Between the Worlds, and the one on the right-hand side is The Journey to the Heart of the Abyss. Now, the protagonists of the trilogy, sister and brother Ella and Jonathan, meander between contemporary Israel and the ancient Babylonian Empire, where they battle the dark and mysterious forces that lurk in the abyss. And the siblings encounter demons and forge relationships with some of the local inhabitants. And the readers of the Leviathan trilogy are transported to a fantastical rendition of ancient Babylonia, which is replete with magic and is subjugated by the satraps, who are these powerful magicians and merciless rulers. Now, the specific choice of the Babylonian era as the time space in which the protagonists battle the dark forces is significant, because Babylonia functions as a synecdoche for the Babylonian exile and its paramount impact upon Jewish tradition and the metaphor of the yearning for the Promised Land. So the Babylonian exile is a historical event which is depicted in the Hebrew Bible as a formative, traumatic cultural event that occurred during the 6th century BCE. And this historical event engraved notions of nostalgic yearning to the Promised Land, whose influence resonates in contemporary Israeli culture. Reflecting a Judaic tradition of yearning to return home, Yanai's characters are nostalgic for a home that no longer exists and perhaps only ever existed as an ideal. So, in Yanai's trilogy, the Babylonian Empire is likewise a place and a state of mind. And the cure for the depression caused by the abyss in Yanai's novels, the abyss appears to threaten the empire, and the abyss functions as a metaphor for loss of identity. So in Yanai's novels, the cure for the abyss is, quote, a life of milk and honey. So in Yanai's novels, she offers this biblical allusion to the land of milk and honey and outlines the promised land as an idea of opulence and serenity. Yet the trilogy ends with the kids magically relocating their mother from modern Israel to ancient Babylon and establishing their home there. So the dichotomous representation of home versus Babylon is subverted, as Yanai suggests that home is where one establishes social connections and creates identities. Yanai's fantasy Babylon allows modern Israelis to continue yearning to the promised land even while modern Israel exists in a parallel time space. Yanai's trilogy is steeped in Judaic tradition and the Promised Land chronotype. So, for example, the second book, The Water Between the Worlds, commences with an epitaph from Jeremiah. Quote, "Come with me to Babylon if you like, and I will look after you. But if you don't want to come, don't. Look, the whole country lies before you. Go wherever you please," end quote. So this is a quote from the Hebrew Bible, from Jeremiah, and the utterance in the biblical text is told by a Babylonian commander to Jeremiah the prophet. And the biblical text emphasizes that the exile is the Israelites' punishment because they sinned. And the reader of the Hebrew Bible is reminded of Jeremiah's prophecy to accept their fate and accept the Babylonian king as a divine agent. So both the biblical narrative and Yanai's texts outline a yearning for the promised land as they engage with questions of free will and fate. And while the trilogy seems to end with the kids in the Babylonian exile, it also ends with a variation of domestic bliss, with the kid's mother knitting sweaters for Pazuzu, the demon's offsprings. And Yanai utilizes the Babylonian exile as signifier for the yearning for home in the broad, historical, religious, national level, to explore the personal and even intimate notion of a nostalgia to one's childhood innocence. So for Yanai, the Babylonian exile is a metaphor for the exile from childhood, which is an ever-enduring, unattainable promised land. The time space of Yanai's novels offer an exciting ride across ancient Near Eastern realms, allowing the readers to recognize some of the staples of desert terrain, even while the action is set in a fantastical, magical world. Now, the novels are written in modern spoken Hebrew of the 21st century Israel, yet the cultural world is immersed in Babylonian traditions. And so to this cultural combination, Yanai adds a playful conversation with 21st century technological, archaeological, and medical knowledge, creating a Judaic-Israeli journey across time and space. Now, whereas Yanai weaves her novels as a mixture of ancient culture, concepts, and deities, and 21st century linguistic traditions, Shimon Adaf's fantastical worlds invite readers to experience a linguistic transportation as well as the spatial and temporal dislocation. And I'd mention here Rina Jeanbourg's exploration of temporality and the language in Adaf's work. And indeed, one of the most intriguing aspects of Adaf's work is his unique language. And the combination of ancient Judaic linguistic tradition and cutting-edge 21st century tech terminology presents the readers with Judaic Israeli science fiction and fantasy. So one of Adaf's significant contribution to Judaic Israeli science fiction and fantasy is best illustrated in the first and last books of the Judea-Rose trilogy, Nuntia, Kfor, and Undercities, Arim Shulmata. So Nuntia, Kfor, is the orange one on the left, and Undercities is the blue one. I'm not going to talk today about Mox Nox, which is the third leg of the trilogy. And Nuntia and Undercities built, as well as Mox Nox, built upon Judaic tradition and Israeli cultural references to create a nuanced and multi-layered conflation of history, culture, and fantasy. And in the novel, both character construction and plot development are anchored in Judaic traditions and Israeli culture and invite the readers to a journey that unfolds some of the intricacies of Judaic and Israeli identities. So Nuntia is set in a futuristic Tel Aviv in which ancient Judaic traditions are interleaved with innovative technology. And the setting of the novel includes references to Tel Aviv streets and locations, yet the city is a dystopian space to which Jews come from all over the world and, quote, build a city, give it a name from the past, a charged name, engulfed in mystery, immersed in grandeur, not the fourth or fifth return of Zion, a second coming to Tel Aviv, end quote. Now, in these few sentences, Adaf converges realistic past and fantastical future, as well as Jewish mysticism and Zionism. The inhabitants of Adaf's Tel Aviv are survivors of a global catastrophe, and they are oppressed by a strict Orthodox Jewish religious regime that follows dictums that resemble the Second Temple era, and prohibits relationships between Jews and non-Jews, as well as between humans and machine-enhanced humans. Undercities takes the reader to Berlin and Tel Aviv and Sderot, which is the city where Adaf grew up. And he explores Jewish identities upon the backdrop of Kabbalah, mysticism, and the question of Judaism in the context of space and time. So the novel follows two plot lines that merge as the protagonist's journey leads them to uncover the meanings of the mysterious Judaic rose, which is both a linguistic symbol and a gate between worlds, and is thus an absolute brilliant literary embodiment of the heart of Jewish Israeli identities as the manifestation of spirituality and spatiality. And the spatial metaphors in Undercities are so ingrained in the Promised Land chronotope that even the names of several characters are significant places in Judaic mystical traditions. So the three siblings in one of the plot lines are called Tveria, Tiberias, Akko, Acre, and Tzfat. So Tiberias and Tzfat are considered holy cities that are linked with Rabbi Akiva and his disciples. And this is significant for the trilogy's plotline that outlines an alternative, subversive Jewish sect that rejected Rabbi Akiva's path. Akko is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible in the context of the wars of the Israelites and the local people. In Undercities, whereas Tveria explores her humanity in the connection of mysticism through poetry, her brother Akko tries to understand the significance of human existence by creating a computer language that will create poetry. The baby brother Tzfat, who was born with some form of neurodiversity, dies at the age of 3 without acquiring linguistic abilities. Now, Tveria and Akko traveled from Israel across the world to Europe and the United States, only to realize the prominence and pull and power of the Promised Land. Adaf's novels suggest that the core of Jewish identities, and inevitably Jewish Israeli identities as well, is the paradoxical connection to the Promised Land. On the one hand, Judaism commands Jews to inhabit the Promised Land, and on the other hand, They must always yearn and pray for it, never really inhabiting a land that seems to only exist as a fantasy. Thus, the Promised Land already becomes a place and a fantasy, and in this sense, Judaic Israeli science fiction and fantasy is the epitome genre that encapsulates Jewish Israeli identities as a fundamentally contradictory tension between fantasy and reality, utopia and dystopia. Now, in contrast to Judaic Israeli science fiction and fantasy texts, which form a conversation primarily with Jewish Israeli readership, Universalist Israeli science fiction and fantasy opens a conversation with global readers. So Universalist science fiction and fantasy does not refer to Jewish traditions or Israeli spaces, quite the contrary. Universalist Israeli science fiction and fantasy refers either to distinctly fantastical spaces or worlds or real places that are anywhere but Israel. And in the absence of the Promised Land chronotype, or indeed any Jewish Israeli cultural and spatial references in texts that are written in Hebrew by Jewish Israeli writers in Israel, makes this lack noticeable. So following these patterns of Universalist Israeli science fiction and fantasy are Eshkar Ehrlich Briefmann's Winter Blue series. So the series follows the adventures of Winter Blue, the fairy child, and her friends, and the books are set along the tensions between the human world and magic land, yet the human world bears absolutely no resemblance to recognizably Israeli spaces. And the realistic features include universalist aspects of childhood, such as attending school, and might appeal to children all over the world. And indeed, perhaps this is the reason that 2 books of the series have already been translated into English, whereas Yanai and Adaf have not been translated yet. There are numerous examples of Universalist Israeli science fiction and fantasy texts, many of which appeared in Hayoyeh and Bli Panika and were nominated for or won the Geffen Award. And a recent example of Universalist Israeli science fiction and fantasy published in Hayoyeh is The Harbinger by Yael Fuhrman. So Yael Fuhrman published many science fiction and fantasy short stories, as well as 2 novels that will be discussed later in the hybrid Judaic Universalist Israeli science fiction fantasy section. And while many of Fuhrman's texts are set in Israel and consider Israeli social concerns, many others are set in fantastical realms and explore universal philosophical and ethical questions. So The Harbinger is set in a fantastical world terrorized by a dark, tyrannical ruler, King Karadak, who feeds on his population. The king has a system to lure young men who think they are destined to vanquish the dragon and save the realm. They are summoned by myths, the harbinger plants in their communities, and when they follow what they think is a calling to fulfill their destiny as survivors, they meet their death as they battle the dragon. So in the story, following the death, the predictable death of yet another naive knight, enters a young knight with a strikingly high voice like a woman's. Spoiler alert, she's a woman. Who convinces the harbinger to change sides, and together they defeat the evil ruler and free themselves and the kingdom. And the majority of the action takes place in a wooded area that oversees the magical palace, which is the facade that lures the gullible men to attempt to fight the monster and free the realm. Now, there is no mention of Israel, any Israeli locations, or any Judaic traditions, and the readers are invited to consider universal issues regarding gender roles and social norms. Another example of universalist Israeli science fiction and fantasy that appeared in the same issue of Hayoye is A Birthday Experience from Another World by Lily Day. So this story is set in a futuristic world in which each person can purchase a dead person with whom they get to spend their birthday. And then while some choose to spend their birthday with grandparents, the protagonist of the story prefers to commission a dead celebrity to entertain her each year on her birthday. And the short story follows the unnamed narrator's reviews of her purchases of years 2056 to 2060, of her purchases of dead celebrities from the next world. One she describes is Danny Kaye, who is charming, talented, and attentive, and receives a raving review. The following year, she purchases Fred Astaire, who turns out to be a disappointment. Then, to compensate the dissatisfied customer, they, from the next world, offer her a 2-for-1 combo, but the protagonist is not pleased with her Laurel and Hardy deal, which was charming, but she really felt like she was intruding upon their perfect duo. Her utter disappointment with David Bowie the following year leads her to try Danny Kaye again, only this time he disappoints, not at all like his charming self. And as she wonders what happens there, she declares they lost a customer. And the story ends with her conclusion of her customer experience as disgraceful. And the short story is a humorous exploration of universalist questions regarding death. And there is nothing that connects the narrative to Israel or Judaic traditions. One of Israel's most prolific science fiction and fantasy writers, Karen Landsman, offered a short story in the same issue called Stitches and Claws, which in Hebrew is Tfarim v'Tufarim, in which Landsman explores same-sex relationships set in a futuristic world in which female technicians and multi-gendered priests worship technology and oil gods. Now, Hebrew is a heavily gendered language, not unlike Spanish. So the chair is masculine, the floor is feminine, everything is gendered. And Landsman refers to the technicians using the feminine form, thus ensuring her readers are fully aware from the onset to gender issues. And the plot of the story entails a visit to the city of Ukula, also referred to as the Needle, Hell, or Stench, in which Shachar, the technician, is required to descend to the city to obtain oil from one of the temples of worship. And so she descends to perform her task, and due to an accident in the temple, she and the priestess with whom she had a previous romantic encounter are compelled to take a long leave of absence, which they are both delighted to take. Now, while some Israeli science fiction and fantasy texts offer an escapist, non-Israeli world and other emphasized Judaic aspects, many Israeli science fiction and fantasy texts operate in a hybrid form that pulls upon universalist science fiction and fantasy tropes while maintaining certain links to Jewish tradition and Israeli identities and settings. And then the global issues that hybrid Judaic and universalist Israeli science fiction and fantasy texts explore range from genetic engineering and climate change to social discrimination and inclusivity, yet they all share a certain Jewish-Israeli layer that pertains specifically to the area of the Promised Land. So, for example, whereas in Stitches and Claws, Landsman did not focus on any specific Judaic notions or refer to Israeli locations, in the heart of the circle, so this is a novel and is available in English. Landsman employs an interesting variant of hybrid Judaic and universalist Israeli science fiction that weaves very delicate threads of specific Israeli locations and social concerns into otherwise very universalist narratives. Now, both Stitches and Claws and The Heart of the Circle explore gender issues while focusing on class or caste-based marginalization and discrimination. So the plot of The Heart of the Circle is set in Israel, and many of the places are easily recognizable as they are set in Tel Aviv. And the explicit reference to the Rabin assassination anchors the narrative in Israeli culture. So the novel explores a society in which people with magical abilities are not only marginalized, but are segregated in a manner reminiscent of apartheid in South Africa or the Jim Crow era in the United States. And the narrative follows Reed, the empath or moody same gender, through the metaphor of a relationship between people with the same powers. An intriguing novel that productively uses the hybridity of Judaic and Universalist Israeli science fiction and fantasy is Asaf Gavron's Hydromania. So, set in a couple of decades from now, the novel offers a dystopian depiction of the remnants of Israel after it has been depleted of most of its territories and water sources. And the spatial reduction in Gavron's novel is the result of the ongoing conflict with the Palestinians, who have gained access to advanced weapons and consequently reduced Israel to Caesarea Tiberias, as well as a few other towns and villages in the area. Now, the water shortage, which is part of a global water shortage crisis, is then exacerbated when the Palestinians attack and conquer Tiberias, thus cutting off the Israelis' main water source. Now, while the novel is set specifically in Israel, referring to Israeli cities and terrain and to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, it explores the specificity of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict within a global perspective. And the local clashes over space and resources are presented as part of worldwide battles which are driven by global corporations that manipulate local governments and populations to maximize profit. Now, the plot of Hydromania follows an Israeli woman whose husband mysteriously disappears following a secretive meeting with dubious clients and mafia-like corporate representatives regarding his innovative water collection and purification device. As the mystery is resolved, the readers join the protagonist, Maya, for 9 months as she carries her husband's child and invention from seed to fruition. After she finds out she's pregnant, she joins her brother's family in Harod, a village that used to be Ein Harod. Now, Ein Harod is a real place in real Israel that exists now. But also, the minimized Harod in Gavron's novel functions as a spatial metaphor for the depleted Israel in the novel, and the history of Ein Harod, the real Ein Harod, underscores the history of the real Israel, especially with regard to Zionist settlement and water resources. So Ein Harod, the real Ein Harod, the real Ein Harod was one of the main kibbutzim established in the early 1920s and is named after the nearby spring. So the fountain is called in Arabic Ein Jalut, and in Hebrew the spring of Goliath, and in Hebrew Ein Harod. And the name Harod is also mentioned in the Hebrew Bible in the context of the Israelites' battle against Midian, as Gideon selects his warriors based on whether they lap the water directly from the spring or kneel to drink. Now, the name is also a literary allusion to Amos Kenan's famous dystopian novel, The Way to Ein Harod, published in 1984, which follows the protagonist, Rafi, in his journey from Tel Aviv to Ein Harod after a coup has left Israel under military regime. Now, whereas Kenan in the 1984 novel depicts a world in which the Israeli forces demolished many kibbutzim and exiled most of the local Arab population, Gavron portrays the opposite narrative in which the Palestinians have seized the majority of the area, and the Israelis are the refugees. So hydromania thus subverts several narratives regarding Israel, including and particularly the idea that spaces and places of the land are promised. And on the one hand, the novel is in conversation with Judaic Israeli traditions, including modern Hebrew literary explorations of utopia and dystopia. And on the other hand, hydromania can be located among cli-fi trends that consider climate change and global concerns. Another example of texts that explore social concerns which are not particularly Jewish Israeli are Yael Fuhrman's young adult novels, The Glasshouse Children and World Fragments. So The Glasshouse Children is the one on the left where you see a mermaid, and the one on the right is World Fragments. Now, both World Fragments and The Glasshouse Children are tagged as young adult literature and explore adolescent anxieties alongside environmental and ethical concerns. And the texts are set in Israel but explore Universalist issues, and the characters and plot do not revolve around Judaic notions or the Promised Land. The Glasshouse Children is set in a futuristic Israel in which genetic engineering exposes social issues such as marginalization and discrimination. And the narrative follows Shaked, a young girl whose family lives in an apartment building shared by human and merfolk. And Shaked knows merfolk language, which is sign language, so she can communicate with her best friend, Kyla, who is a mermaid. And now the friends face various challenges. For example, when Shaked's classmates mock Kyla's nudity, and when social activists pass a law that prohibits the confinement of merfolk. And while at first Shaked is really fearful for her friend in the wild, eventually she understands that freedom is paramount. World Fragments is set in a fairly realistic contemporary Israel, yet the plot follows two kids, Gil and Liron, who are sucked into a virtual reality game, which Gil had created. And then Gil and Liron find themselves trapped in the game, caught in the midst of a battle between two powerful sorceresses, and they have to complete the game in order to return home. And so the spatial shift from Israeli reality to the virtual world allows the book to merge the plot and the character development into the narrative time space. And the book outlines a narrative of return home, yet is not anchored specifically in the Promised Land chronotype. Rather, it explores broad issues regarding faith and religiosity and friendship and social norm and expectations. The final example of hybrid Judaic, Universalist, and Israeli science fiction that I will give is a short story called Twins by Ilan Eshkoli. Like Fuhrman's Glasshouse Children, Twins explores questions regarding genetic engineering by positioning transnational questions in a local Israeli setting. Now, the short story follows the bizarre occurrence of a 7-month-old baby replicating herself. As the father, Oded, tries to figure out a way to resolve the issue, he reaches out to an old acquaintance from his army service, Yirmi. Yirmi puts him in touch with Pomeranz, who has an unclear army background and very forceful militarized presence. And when Oded refuses to let Pomeranz experiment on the babies, his wife asks whether he thinks Pomeranz is some kind of Mengele. Now, the invocation of Josef Mengele, who had experimented on people during the Holocaust, brings the already horrifying story to the brink of the unthinkable horror of Jewish history. And the replication of the babies in the story explores questions regarding genetic engineering as well as quantum physics theories. And while the story positions these universal queries in a recognizably Jewish Israeli environment that includes the shadow of the Holocaust and military involvement, neither plot nor character development are linked with notions of the Promised Land. To conclude, the generic subdivision between Judaic Israeli science fiction, Universalist Israeli science fiction and fantasy, and hybrid Judaic Universalist Israeli science fiction and fantasy highlights the distinctions between these three subgenres, as well as the overarching unifying elements. And the three kinds of Israeli science fiction and fantasy adhere to transcultural science fiction and fantasy generic ontological conventions, forging a fundamental unifying bridge between Israeli and global readers. Thank you. Thank you very much. I am happy to take questions. No question? Yes. Oh, wait, so to take questions so that everyone who are joining us virtually will be able to hear the question. Thank you. Sorry. I don't know. Can you hear her?
Yeah.
I had a question. It was like, if you could recommend any of those books, what one would you start with first?
Ooh, that's a really tough question. That's kind of asking, who do you love more, mum and dad? It's like, they're all great. I'll tell you how I can answer this fairly easily by first recommending the ones that are translated into English. So that kind of limits. So I would definitely recommend The Heart of the Circle. Just a quick reminder, did I spoil it? I don't think I did. Oh no, you don't know what happens in the end, right? We know that there is a love affair between Lee and Reed, and they're both empaths. It is, I think, very engaging, and I would very warmly recommend this one. I can also recommend several short stories that were translated and that actually I teach in some of my courses. So last term, for example, we read a wonderful short story called the Gorgon, Schrodinger's Gorgon, which is a short story set in outer space, and I think already from the title, if you know anything about Gorgons, their stare in ancient Greek mythology, the Gorgon's stare would kill you. You would turn into stone if the Gorgon if you looked at the Gorgon. And Schrodinger's cat is a wonderful thought experiment. No cats were harmed in the experiment. It's a theoretical experiment in which you place a cat in a box with a switch, and and if the cat can, kill itself, and because of I'm not a physicist. This is my understanding of the experiment. Because of quantum mechanics physics, theoretically, certain theories suggest that the cat is simultaneously alive and dead until you can actually open the box and confirm. So it has to do, Schrodinger's cat experiment has to do with the effect of our perception upon our reality. Whether you look at a certain particle, if you test it as a wave, or if you test it as... So those of you who study physics are nodding at me. Obviously, I'm saying, yeah, I've got it right. So it has to do with the way that our perception of things alter reality. So Schrodinger's Gorgon, I can recommend that. We also read Sea of Salt by Ilana Gomel, who was our guest here last term. And she writes wonderful Israeli science fiction and fantasy. So we read Sea of Salt, which is a short story. She's written several novels. I think one of my favorite of her novels is called Black House. I can recommend literally all of her texts. So Ilana Gomel. I can go on, but I will stop here because, as I said at the beginning, there are scores of excellent texts. I will be very happy to provide the actual texts to anyone who is interested, which is one of the reasons that I provided my email here. If anyone is interested in reading Israeli science fiction and fantasy, please do not hesitate. Send me an email, and I would be very, very happy to send at least 2 short stories to pique your interest. Yeah.
It seems like Shadow and Bones is very popular now, and I don't know if you've had a chance to read it or see it, but I believe an Israeli American wrote it in this. Oh, sorry.
I don't think I know the text.
Have any of you seen Shadow and Bones? Or yeah, so I think I know our daughter is watching it, and I think it's a more popular thing, and I think it's written by an Israeli American or someone who came here when they were young, and I was just curious if you had read it, whether there are any aspects of Israeli kind of context or culture that you see in there, even though it's speaking to a more universal world, I think. But
I'm afraid I haven't seen the show. It's a TV show.
Is it on Netflix or what is it on? Or, yeah, right. It's on Netflix and it's a trilogy. Yeah. Okay.
Well,
No. Okay.
That's definitely something for me to look into. Thank you.
I have a question about audience. So naturally, if an Israeli author writes for an Israeli audience, there are limits to numbers, right? So there's no comparison between how many books a typical successful Israeli author publishes within Israel in comparison with a typical American author writing to an American audience. And people do have to make a living. So when you probably you have conversations with some of these authors, does this issue of audience and whether their books are interesting at all to an international audience, meaning that there's a reason to translate it, and maybe other publishing houses that are outside of Israel would be interested in publishing this. Is this something that Israeli authors are concerned about at all?
Thank you. That's a very good question, and it varies. I know that some of the authors, when I say, I spoke with Ishkar. Let me just pull up the text. So I communicated with Ishkar, and she many times when she's interviewed, people say, "Oh, were you writing it specifically so it will be translatable?" And she says, No, I wrote it because that's what I wanted to write. And conversely, if we think about something like Shimon Adaf. So Shimon Adaf is also, he's a very prolific and very, he's a fascinating poet. And, I tried to translate 2 lines and it was really, really difficult. But he cannot write this kind of text in any other language but in Hebrew, precisely because Hebrew is so multi-layered, and every other line is a literary allusion, and he cannot write his work unless he does it like that. And so initially, when I talk to poets and writers, Israeli poets and writers, the majority of them say, I have to write what I have to write. I can't, if they're any good, they don't think about that when they write. But, there's so that's about language and translation. It's great when it's translated, and one of the reasons that I have a mixture in the presentation and in the chapter of texts that have been translated and those that are not translated yet is because I'm hoping some translators and some publishing houses might stumble upon this and pick it up and indeed translate these texts. But there are other issues that limit readership, that go beyond just the language, right? Certain ideas that are so ingrained specifically in Judaic Israeli science fiction and fantasy, that will make the translation very difficult, really very challenging, because every line that I read, or a Jewish Israeli reader, will immediately pick up on those multi-layered allusions. That's really hard. How do you translate something like just the short 2 lines that I translated? How do you explain the history of Tel Aviv as the first Hebrew city? In those 2 lines where I talked about the return to Tel Aviv. So it sort of has to be negotiated, or is better read when negotiated with some explanation. It can be done. You can translate with annotations, but it is very difficult. So from my experience, the writers themselves don't think about it, because that would really just they wouldn't be able to do their art if they had those thoughts. But I am encouraged by. Sorry, I wanted to get to. I am encouraged by. So Hydromania has been translated, and this, on the face of it, it would be difficult to translate. And of course, some of the things are lost in translation, but still, works are being translated, and hopefully many more will be translated. Yeah.
Well, I really enjoyed your lecture. It was fantastic, and
Thank you.
it triggers all kinds of imagination. My question about Judaic Israeli sci-fi, of course, goes back to a lot of sci-fi goes back to ancient kingdoms, and also
Right.
to futuristic. Can go that whole perspective. So the Babylonian exile, my understanding, was like 5th century BCE.
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm not
Historians back us up on that.
sure. I'm not sure if the Bible ends before the Babylonian exile or includes the Babylonian exile.
Oh, it's there. The Hebrew Bible definitely refers to the Babylonian exile.
It refers to is that one of the books of prophets or of kings or?
Oh, absolutely. So the quote that I it definitely refers to the Babylonian exile. It is one of the formative, cultural, traumatic events that really forged this idea of yearning to the promised land. So I give a quote from Jeremiah.
It's a short exile. Isn't it like 70 years or less than 100 years?
Right.
Compared to the exile of Rome.
Right.
Thousands of years, 2 millennium.
Right.
So, because I wasn't sure if the Bible prophesized the Babylonian exile or was written after it. That was my question.
So the short answer is both, right? So the biblical narrative presents the prophecy, right? So Jeremiah offers the prophecy of the exile, and then the biblical narrative confirms whether it was actually written before or after. I will allow the historians and archaeologists to debate about that. But so I read the biblical text and any scriptures as a cultural artifact, and so as far as I'm concerned, the text both prophesies it and then confirms it as an act, a divine act, as retribution for the Israelites' sin. That's how the biblical narrative articulates this, and indeed as a formative national cultural trauma that really, forms this yearning for the return to the Promised Land, which later will, of course, evolve into Zionism.
Thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. Oh, do you have a question?
Hi, sorry. So thank you so much. It was really interesting. Really, really interesting. I'm not a sci-fi or fantasy person, but I know like a little bit from my husband who is. And so I'm curious how much the Universalist, so this is kind of a piggyback on Yore's question about, but it's not about translation. It's more about who people, and it's more about audience in the question of, so like the Universalist that you mentioned, the story where they can talk to celebrities. They can have celebrities.
About the experience from another world.
Right. And they're all American celebrities. Yep. None of them are Israeli celebrities.
Absolutely.
And so, and also, this is also thinking about like the one that was Landsman about the people who are empaths that all have special powers that are segregated. Sounds exactly like X-Men, right?
Yep.
And so are Universalists more in conversation with American science fiction producers and genres and materials, and/or are Jewish science fiction and fantasy writers more in touch with diaspora Jews all over the world, maybe?
So, thank you. So, this generic subdivision is my generic subdivision. The authors themselves do not identify as Universalist writers, Judaic writers. This is where the literary critic comes and, plays around with generic rubrics. And, it was important for me to show that some writers write, they write Judaic Israeli science fiction, and then they write Universalist science fiction. So they do not have an allegiance to any genre. Again, they write whatever works. But it is fundamentally clear that all of these writers are in conversation with Universalist science fiction and fantasy tropes and trends, and if you look at the history of science fiction and fantasy in Israel, on the one hand you can trace it back to detective novels and Chassamba stories, as well as, and we haven't even started talking about graphic novels, and these texts were always in conversation because the people who wrote them read, whether they read Arthur Conan Doyle and kind of wrote detective novels that were similar, or whether they read, various graphic novels, comic, and then worked with that genre. They were in conversation, and they are in conversation. And I don't want to outline the entire history of science fiction and fantasy Israel, but I think there are certain important moments. For example, in the 1990s, with the huge, massive immigration of people from the formerly known as the USSR immigrated. We're talking about 1.5 million people immigrated to Israel and brought with them a very rich culture of science fiction and fantasy, Russian, Ukraine, what used to be known as the USSR. And so that really boosted the local scene. And there are interesting conversations with that tradition, and definitely the Anglo-American traditions, of course, both in literature and cinema, are present in, I think in all the texts, even the ones that are Judaic Israeli science fiction and fantasy. They use all kinds of, for example, in the Adaf's trilogy, there are scenes where the protagonist tries to work with certain genetic aspects, and it looks just like if you've seen Minority Report, with it, the scene is, anyone who has seen that really recognizes it, that it's present in the text. And there are so many of these connections. I think, one of the interesting things about Israeli science fiction and fantasy broadly is that it is simultaneously universal, right? We're talking about, even here, we're talking about siblings and the relationship. That's a universal question. And some of the texts are really steeped in Judaic tradition or Israeli landscape. And there's always this, I think, very interesting and productive tension, how much of that is in the text. So I think the readers, for sure, the readers of the text are in conversation with world literature, especially now when everything is so accessible and so handy. We all read as much as we can from everywhere. And I think it's a very productive conversation. I thought we had a question here. No? Follow up.
That was a great answer, but are there any movies being made of any of these, to go back to cinema, and something that people might be able to watch? Like, back to your question, but about film.
So thank you for that. So to the best of my knowledge, these have not been made into films. But so I focused on literature for this talk, but as my students know, this lecture is being held in my Israeli cinema and television course, where we are now in the week that explores Israeli speculative cinema and television. So there are definitely films. We have Israeli horror films, and we have Israeli science fiction. I'm actually currently working on a paper for a conference about this Israeli science fiction young adult series called Infinity, which again, right, it's called Infinity. it's not a translation. In Hebrew, it's called infinity. It's written phonetically. Why? Because most of the viewers, the Infinity, the TV series, follows a group of teenagers who are in this special school for science prodigies. And there's a mystery, and someone may or may not have been murdered, and they are doing some time traveling to figure out that mystery. So no spoilers there. And that TV series, for example, is called Infinity in Hebrew because the makers know that the viewers are in conversation with Anglo-American culture. So when they talk about it, they can talk about Infinity, the series, and they don't have to talk about Ein Sof, which is Hebrew for infinity. Yeah.
Does it deal with space travel, or interplanetary travel?
Sorry.
My
Thank
question is, does any Israeli sci-fi deal with space or interplanetary travel, or like 2000: A Space Odyssey, things of that nature?
Yes. So there are, Kian Omri offered a generic division of Israeli, so she focused on science fiction, and there is Israeli Hebrew science fiction about aliens, about space travel. There are alternative histories. Each and every genre that we find in world science fiction and fantasy, we have it in Hebrew, and many times it does get this added value of Judaic Israeli science fiction and fantasy, but many times it's just interplanetary travel. This conversation, I'm always hopeful that it works both ways, right? Like a good conversation, that that Israeli science fiction and fantasy incorporates all the trends and all the genres, including aliens and space travel and everything, and then when Judaic Israeli science fiction and fantasy incorporates these particularly Judaic or Israeli tropes, hopefully when it gets translated, it introduces people to these particular elements that are unique. So yes, there are literally everything. Including Omri outlines a very interesting connection to biblical narratives, and she reads, the inception of these genres already, possibly in the biblical narrative. So suggesting it's a very, very common trope of interplanetary travel and acquaintances meeting with aliens. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you. So hope you enjoyed it. I know that a lot of you have to dash to the next class. Stay safe, be well, and I will see you on Thursday. Okay.